But as I'm listening to this debate, and I remarked to Senator Cohen earlier, it's almost transporting me back in time, it feels, to the legislative halls, and in particular the halls of Congress in the 1960s. The discussion about the impact on society if this bill were to pass, the impact on our families, the disintegration of relationships, confusion among the children. Our institutions will be riven in dispute, civil disobedience. All you need to do is substitute terms from the floor here today, and it'd be like reading it out of the congressional record from 1964 and 1965 on a different topic, but a related topic, a civil rights topic. Members, I wasn't just using hyperbole when I said we shouldn't go back to those days. We have an opportunity today to take another step forward into the bright sunshine of civil rights. And whatever we do today, if we pass this bill, it will not affect my marriage. The extraordinarily long hours in the legislature from January to May every year might affect my marriage. But a same-sex couple next door that gets married is not going to affect my marriage one little bit. And it won't affect my kids. And when my daughter says that her friend has two mommies, and we see them at the birthday parties, she doesn't say it with animosity. She doesn't know any differently. As Senator Sieben said, the language that we use today becomes the inner voice of our children. My daughter will grow up thinking that this is the way it has always been. And she'll read in a history book someday about how it was before, just like we read in the history books how it was at the turn of the century, as Senator Reinhardt talked about, when the issue was gender and voting rights for women, and how it was in the 60s when we were talking about voting rights and civil rights for people of color. And in the 90s, when President Bush passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, then the discussion was about people with disabilities. Members, God made gays. And God made gays capable of loving other people, including other persons of the same gender. So who are we to quarrel with God's intentions? Is it indeed that for thousands of years, marriage has been defined as between one man and one woman? As I recall my biblical history, Abraham had more than one wife. Jacob had more than one wife. Solomon had 1,000 wives. Times change. Perceptions of what's acceptable in society change. There are even places in the United States where, within certain religious faiths, it is still acceptable for one man to be married to more than one wife. Members, we've talked a little bit about the separation of church and state. We've had some of these discussions on the Senate floor before that I have participated in. It's an issue of some personal concern of mine. And I have served on the Civil Rights Committee of the Anti-Defamation League, and I have analyzed these issues over time and in my personal life. Members, the separation of church and state is for the protection of each. for the protection of religion against the intrusion of the state, as well as the protection of the state from being overridden by religiosity of those who would impose their own legitimately held and personally strong beliefs upon the rest of us. Such, I submit to you, is one of the conceptions of marriage that is presently imbued in our statutory law. But it need not always be so. We have the capacity in a democracy to collectively make this kind of a change, and we have seen how that has informed decisions in various ways around the country. I believe that if we pass this law today and it's signed into law, that we will become the 12th state in the nation to do this. Democracy reflects changing viewpoints of our constituents. And I will submit to you that in 5 years or 10 years, those of you who have districts that voted 65% in favor of the amendment last fall would find that that might poll in the 40s. People's views change, much of it from personal experience. They get to know people with differences. Just so that the record is clear, Senator Westrom had made reference to some statutory changes in case law. The Baker decision addressing the issues that we are talking about in somewhat today was in 1971, and the first statute in Minnesota that defined marriage as between a man and a woman was in 1978, not 1997. 1978. I look around the room and many of us were probably teenagers in those years. It's a bit of history, and as far as I'm concerned, it ought to remain in history, but we need not repeat it. One senator said today that we should not legislate what you think is personally wrong. Let me turn it around. Do legislate what you think is personally right. For those of you who are still wrestling in your own conscience with how to handle this decision today, let me submit the following to you. If your district right now suggests that you vote in one direction, maybe it's not the way they're going to be in 3 years. For those of you who are struggling with a conflict between your conscience and your politics, who know that in your own mind, in your own heart, the right vote is to vote yes, but you're concerned about offending a close family member or an extended family, let me submit that you're not alone. But in the end, you will have to live with your own conscience more than with anyone else. When you wake up in the morning and look in the mirror, you will look at your own conscience. When you go to bed at night and you have trouble sleeping, it will be your conscience that keeps you awake or that gives you the peace of mind to sleep. Members, our constituents sent us here to do two things, and sometimes they're in conflict. One was to try to gather as best we can the viewpoints of our constituents and to try to implement those viewpoints in enacting laws. But the other, sometimes conflicting reason that we are here is as their delegate, as their representative, to spend the time digging into the issues and sitting through the committee hearings that they can't because they are at home taking care of their lives. They send us here to do this work for them, to learn more about things, to ponder things, to think about things perhaps more deeply than they have had time or the inclination to do. And even when they do think deeply about these things and convey their message to us, we are here, members, ultimately, I believe, to lead. And sometimes leading means expressing a viewpoint that may be different than the viewpoints of the majority of our constituents. To be opinion leaders, to help educate, to help shape their viewpoints. It's a balance, a difficult one, and I'm fortunate that I'm not often in a position of conflict between the people that I represent and my own conscience. But ultimately, members, I think that is our duty here. Our constituency will change. This issue is changing so quickly. Members, in my humble judgment, this is indeed the civil rights issue of our generation. We are on the cusp of making an historic decision about what kind of civil rights we will live with, what kind of society we will live in. Do not vote out of fear of your constituents or even of your family. Vote out of your own personal strength, for what you know in your mind and in your heart is the right thing to do for the well-being of the people around us and for society. Please vote yes.